Day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Friday, January 15th, 2021, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Welcome to the show, which is going to be a interesting and different show for today. We had an emergency with one of our employees up here in Sumter, Oregon at the Coffee Pot Dispensary, and they had to take the rest of this week off. So as one of the co-owners and managers, it's up to me to come up and cover the shift. So I've been up here in Sumter, Oregon since Tuesday afternoon, camped out in one of the cabins over across the way. So I've been basically sequestered up here in a snowy mountain town with absolutely nothing to do since Tuesday. Worked on Tuesday and then Wednesday, Thursday, working today. I'll also be working tomorrow. So 5 days straight away from the studio. So if you've been listening to Radical Russ Radio at radicalruss.com and you've been wondering why the news from Tuesday morning has been playing all week, that's why. I haven't got the remote set up yet, the remote access set up on my computers back at the studio, so I can't upload the newest news or make any changes. So that's frustrating. I'll get that fixed next time I'm back there. But for now, we're just going to have to go this way. And for those of you listening to this on the podcast, if it sounds a little different, it's because, again, I'm not at the studio. So I'm just doing this live on YouTube. And then I am going to put that in post-production and add all the elements and advertisements and such afterwards. So it'll be a little different. Plus, I'm at work. Like, I am working right now as a bud tender. And at any moment, someone could come through those doors and want to buy some of our weed. And we got plenty of legal weed here. All sorts of good stuff in the illegal weed department. So if I have to make a break and all of a sudden jump up and make some changes, that's why. I'm dealing with customers and trying to sell them some marijuana, which is, of course, perfectly legal here in the state of Oregon. So on today's show, we're going to start things off with the Cannabis Headline Newsweek. If you haven't been listening to the show for a couple of weeks, I've started this new thing where on the podcast, I do a 15-minute news recap of the biggest stories for the entire week, because those listeners who are only subscribing to the podcast aren't getting the daily Cannabis Headline News that the Patreon subscribers get. For you Patreon subscribers, thank you for joining. A couple of new ones recently. Appreciate that. Check it out at patreon.com/radicalruss. $4.20 a month. You can get all sorts of great content, and you can help me keep this stuff on the air. We've got enough subscribers now that we're pretty much paying the podcasting expenses. And the more subscribers we get, the more I can travel and bring you all sorts of more cannabis content. I hope you appreciate that. Also coming up on today's show, we'll cover some of the news in marijuana, but also I got to take time for some more radical ranting about this insurrection that happened at the Capitol. More and more information is coming out about this, showing this is much worse than we all thought. So all that coming up today on the Russ Belville Show, and stay tuned. The news is next. So I want to take some time out in the rant today to talk about this insurrection that took place at the United States Capitol. You know, we all sat and watched this disaster unfold in real time. And the thing that's frustrating to me about this is that so many of those guys, I see in so many of those guys from the Capitol insurrection, people that I grew up with. Now, I don't make a whole lot of noise about my military background. I was in the Idaho National Guard. I served for 5 years and 9 months, achieved the rank of sergeant, E5. But, you know, I don't really bring it up much because I got a general discharge. I was pretty much kicked out of the National Guard for being a drunk. This was before I found marijuana, of course. And yeah, before I ever smoked a joint, I was a heavy drinker, and it got me into a lot of trouble. Got me failed out of Boise State University, got me kicked out of the National Guard. But that's a whole nother story. I just bring it up because on my 17th birthday, I raised my right hand, and I swore that oath, you know, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And the thing that's frustrating to me about this insurrection that took place is there were a lot of cops in that group and a lot of ex-military in that group, people who had also sworn that very same oath. And they believed deeply in their hearts that what they were doing in that insurrection was obeying that oath, was living up to that oath. They believe deeply that the United States is captured somehow by nefarious internationalist forces that are corrupt and don't listen to the people, and therefore it's a tyranny, and then we need to use our Second Amendment remedy to take on the tyrannical government and overthrow it and preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution from those domestic enemies. And the problem with that thinking is to me, the problem with that thinking comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Constitution is. For these guys, I think the Constitution to them is a noun. The Constitution is like a holy document, like the Bible, right? It's this holy document that tells us what God intends and what our rights are. And basically, to these insurrectionists, to them, the Constitution is a noun, a sacred document that upholds the way things are, or the way things ought to be, right? One man, one woman marriage, Jesus, pray to Jesus in schools, gay people shouldn't get married, whatever, whatever they think the world should be, the way things ought to be. And the problem with that understanding is that when we swear an oath to the Constitution, we're not swearing an oath to a piece of paper. We're not swearing an oath to a thing, a noun. We're swearing an oath to a verb. The verb constitution, to constitute, to be a part of a greater whole. Think about why that Constitution was written, right? They laid it out in the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States for the United States of America. This Constitution, this putting together of separate parts into one whole, for very specific reasons, to promote the general welfare, to provide for the common defense, to secure the blessings of liberty. The Constitution is a verb. It is an action. It is the act of those 13 colonies deciding to form a union and to abide by a structure, a set of rules, a set of procedures by which these disparate colonies and disparate political minds can get along. The Constitution is what enshrines our processes, in other words. So, in defending the Constitution, what you're defending is the ability of people who disagree to believe in a shared framework through which they can work out their differences in a peaceful manner. So, if you're taking up arms, if you're gathering as a mob to disrupt that process by which we all get along, you're subverting that Constitution. And there's another piece to this puzzle. The other piece to this puzzle is the Second Amendment. When they think about preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, they're also thinking about what rights that Constitution grants. And among those are the right to bear arms. And so many of these people, and I know this having grown up in the West and grown up in rural country Christian type of background, not only is there kind of a holiness ascribed to the founding fathers and the Constitution that is misplaced. They were just men. They weren't divinely inspired. They were just men. Some of them owned slaves. They didn't think too much of women. They were imperfect. And that document was imperfect. It had states electing their senators. It had slaves counted as 3/5 of a man. It didn't allow women to vote. It took away Indian lands. I mean, it was imperfect. So these people that I grew up with, they grew up with this idea of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And they ignore the first part of that amendment. Now, we do know since the 2008 Heller decision that the Second Amendment does guarantee a personal right to bear arms. Okay. I'm not disputing that. And by the way, for people that are listening to this that might think I'm kind of an anti-gun guy, I'm not. I'm not. I'm very fond of guns. But the problem with that Second Amendment interpretation is in ignoring the first part of the amendment, these people believe the wrong thing about its intent. I can't tell you how many times I've been around these guys who promote this idea. The Second Amendment is there so that if the government gets out of bounds, we can take our guns and kill it, right? We can go fight against the government with our guns. But let's go back to what that amendment says. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Being necessary to the security of a free state. And when they said state, they don't mean state in the sense of New Jersey or Rhode Island or Oregon, right? They mean state as nation, as country, as political organization of people, right? A state, a nation state, a city state, a political jurisdiction, right? So if we have these militias to protect the security of the state, you can't use those militias to attack the state. That goes against the security of the state, doesn't it? Now, this interpretation of the Second Amendment then leads these guys to believe then that, well, if the government doesn't do what I want it to do, then I've got the right to take a gun and make them do what I want them to do. And that's not what our Constitution's about. Our Constitution is about having politics to replace warfare. It's about having politics so that different people with different agendas and different backgrounds can get along in a framework that's peaceable. So these insurrectionists, these seditionists, what they're saying when they take up their guns, what they're saying when they attack the process by which we have a government, what they're really saying is that what they're doing is they're telling on themselves. They're admitting that they can't win under that structure, that their ideas are now so bankrupt and unpopular, they have to take up arms. It's a betrayal of the Constitution. It's a betrayal of the whole idea that we have a system put together for us to get along and work out our differences. They don't really love the Constitution. They don't really think they're preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution. And let me give you a little thought experiment that proves this. I do this from time to time with guys, especially when on the internet, you'll find these Second Amendment arguments going on. And I'll propose this thought experiment to them. I'll say, all right, let's pretend here for a second. We got a Second Amendment, right? Right to bear arms. So that's part of our Constitution. That's part of what it means to be an American. We have a Constitution that grants us the right to bear arms, right? Right. But we didn't always have that right. The Constitution was signed in June of 1788. And it did not have a Second Amendment. It didn't have any amendments. There was no right to bear arms. Now, by the time 1791 rolls around, December of 1791, the Bill of Rights is ratified. The second of those being the right to bear arms. So between 1788 and 1791, were we Americans? Did we have American rights? Were we living under a constitutional democracy? Yes. We were Americans who did not have an explicit right to bear arms. For 3 whole years, 3.5 whole years, there was no right to bear arms. Now, there may have been at the state level amongst the very, former colonies may have allowed it. It may have been just an assumed right that people had and nobody ever thought to not let them have guns. It's not the point. The point is, for 3.5 years, there was no right to bear arms, there was no Second Amendment, and yet we were still Americans. So, with that in mind, consider, thought experiment here. Imagine sometime in the future that there is enough of a groundswell in opposition to rampant gun violence and unfettered gun ownership. Let's pretend at some point in the future that it becomes such a popular movement that an amendment is proposed to repeal the Second Amendment. An amendment's proposed to repeal the Second Amendment. It goes to the House. They approve it. It goes to the Senate. They approve it. They send it to the states, and 3/4 of the states approve it. 38 states approve this new amendment that repeals the Second Amendment. Now, before we go much further, I don't think this will happen. I don't think there's much chance of it happening. I think even if it got proposed, there's not enough states that would want to pass it. So again, it's just a thought experiment, just playing around here. But we're pretending that there's an amendment that has repealed the Second Amendment, and now the sheriff shows up to your door, knocks on the door, and says, I need you to turn over all of your guns because they're no longer legal. What do? Do you turn over your guns? Do you murder the sheriff? Do you lie to the sheriff, say you have no guns, but keep your guns and keep them hidden? Well, your answer to that kind of reveals what you think of the Constitution, doesn't it? Because the same exact constitutional process that created the Second Amendment has now taken away the Second Amendment. And if you love the Constitution, like you say you love the Constitution, wouldn't you obey the Constitution? Now, somebody in the chat just brought up, is the state going to take care of my protection? I don't know. Again, it's a thought experiment, but the point of this whole thought experiment is, do you love the Constitution or do you just love your guns? And again, I'm not an anti-gun guy. I've grown up around guns. I was in the military, like firing guns. I think it's fine to have a gun. It's fine to have a couple guns. I mean, I've lived out in the country amongst Trumpsters, well-armed Trumpsters, and I'm a well-known liberal. So I get personal protection. I get self-defense. I'm all for that. All I'm trying to say is that the Constitution is a process. And when you swear an oath to defend the Constitution, you're defending that process and the results of that process. There's a viral video going around right now, and if you haven't seen it, it's by a guy named Corey the Buttercream Dream. Looks like a younger version of me. White guy, kind of rednecky, who's going off about these insurrectionists. Like, what the fuck have you ever had to deal with? What kind of oppression have you ever had to deal with? And it went viral because that's really the crux of this, right? These white right-wing Christian nationalist types have been in the majority for most of America's history and have been used to getting their way in one way or another. And now demographics are causing that to no longer be true. Demographics are causing the rise of minority power, gay power, transgender power, all sorts of different groups that have been marginalized in the past now have political power. And they're coming to realize they can't win elections anymore. That the Constitution, the process by which we all get along, doesn't work in their favor anymore, even though it's rigged in their favor. Even though they get the same number of senators for Wyoming as California gets. 600,000 people get 2 senators versus 40 million people get 2 senators. Despite the fact it's rigged in their favor for when it comes to the Electoral College because of that same senatorial issue. Despite the fact it's rigged in their favor because they've got all these Republican secretaries of state and these Republican legislatures that do all sorts of gerrymandering and voter suppression and kicking people off the voting rolls. Even with all the cheat codes, they can't win anymore. So they have to subvert the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't work for them anymore. They have to resort to violence. You want to know who respects the Constitution? Black people. People who were kidnapped, brutally brought over in chains on the bellies of slave ships and forced to work in the fields in the South. And yes, there were slave uprisings, yes, John Brown and so forth. But for the most part, the political progress of African Americans in this country has been through the Constitution. Black people have looked at that Constitution as the only possible savior they had. If we can just get them to live up to those words, all men are created equal. And that's why you got people like Stacey Abrams flipping Georgia. Because black people love the Constitution. They've had to. The Constitution that kept them down, that kept them as 60% of a person, that said that they were chattel, that they were no better than livestock. That same Constitution contained within it the keys to their freedom. And it's still not entirely unlocked. Let's not kid ourselves. But it's gotten better. And it's gotten better through that abiding love of constitutional democracy. Despite the end of Reconstruction, despite Jim Crow, despite the MAGA idiocy that's going on today, we still have this Constitution that provides us a way to address our problems, our differences, without violence. So, Republicans, you got to understand, you lost. You lost. You take the L. When we lost in 2016, despite getting 3 million more votes, we gathered in the streets peaceably. We put on pink pussy hats and we organized to take back the House, to win those Senate races through the constitutional democracy that we thought you all believed in as well. And I think there's a place for the Republican Party. The fear I have right now is the Republicans now devolving into a split between their Nazi element and their business element. And in that deficit of power, we see a growing centrism in the Democratic Party where it tries to become even more of the centrist party, where those disaffected Republican business types will feel comfortable coming over. So that we end up with neither the left nor the right getting really what they want. But it's still pretty amazing to see what's going on with the revelations that are coming out. When this insurrection happened and the impeachment was put on the table, my first thought was that, let's impeach this guy as quickly as we can. Let's try him as quickly as we can. Get him out of the office as quickly as we can. But now I'm starting to see the wisdom in waiting. Waiting until after Joe Biden's president. Waiting until after Trump's not in office anymore to issue pardons to people. Waiting for the trickle of more videos, more reports. People getting their inboxes and their timeline feeds clogged with videos of police officers being beaten with American flags and Blue Lives Matter flags. People seeing that endless loop of MAGA crawling all over the Capitol, taking down American flags and putting up Trump flags. People getting more information about how some of our elected officials were giving tours, scouting reconnaissance tours on January 5th to some of the very same people who they've been in photos with flashing white power signs. People who've been photographed and shown, evidence has shown they were a part of storming the Capitol. Some of these people with what appears to be tactical training, military-style earpieces, hand signals, identifying orange beanies. I'm afraid we are going to find within this attempted coup some of the most scandalous revelations in our country's history. We are literally going to find, I believe, we are literally going to find evidence of congressmen and senators scheming to overthrow the duly elected government of the United States by force. Now, I'm not a death penalty guy. I don't believe in the death penalty. I mean, I believe it exists. I don't believe it should be used. Let me check that. I believe the death penalty should be used in any judicial system that's 100% perfect. If you can show me a 100% perfect judicial system, I'm all for the death penalty. Until then, since I've seen over 200 people be exonerated off of death row through the use of DNA and other evidence, I believe death is a mistake you can never overcome. Even if someone's locked up for 29 years and get out of prison in their 70s, you can still make up for that a little. You can still give them some life. But once you've killed them, oops, DNA, too late to do anything. So I'm not a death penalty guy. But when it comes to this insurrection stuff, this treason, our founding fathers were pretty clear on it. It was like hang by the neck until you're dead kind of crime. It's the only crime in our Constitution that the death penalty is actually mentioned for is treason. I don't know. I still can't approve of the death penalty, but if it were to be used, if anybody deserves that, it would be an elected congressman or senator proven to have helped in the overthrow of our democratic government. That's the only way I can see that. All right, stay tuned. We're going to come back right after this. Thanks for listening to The Rant. We got some marijuana stories coming up right after this. Welcome back, everybody. Checking out some of our news in the world of cannabis. I was pretty interested to see that the UFC has decided to stop disqualifying their mixed martial artists if they test positive for cannabis. I've been following this for quite a bit. I have some old shows where I've interviewed Nate Diaz and Toby Tiger Heart Greer, a couple of mixed martial artists, and we talked about this. And the story is interesting because they say that turning up positive for marijuana metabolites will no longer earn an automatic suspension. If they drug testing, they could only be sanctioned. They could only be sanctioned if the pot was shown to be used for performance enhancing purposes. And most people, I think, when they hear that, are going to kind of laugh. Like, performance enhancing drug, weed? Unless it's like the Nathan's hot dog eating championship. How could that be, right? But it's interesting. I've talked to these mixed martial artists, and they actually point out that there are ways in which you could consider cannabis a performance enhancing drug for a mixed martial artist. Number one, when you're on cannabis, there is a timing thing. Jazz musicians talked about this all the time, about how when you're high, your sense of time is expanded in a sense, and it allows you to, play with the timing of music and grace notes and such. we musicians have talked about that for a long time. When it comes to the mixed martial artists that I talked to, they said that there could be kind of a flow and timing thing that you might get out of being high. You might also get a lack of fear. Like cannabis might help to remove some of the jitters and fear one naturally has when stepping into an octagon with someone who wants to punch you in the face repeatedly. They also talked about how, of course, the pain relief of cannabis. We're talking about a sport in which pain is what can cause you to lose, tapping out, right? So if you're able to withstand more pain because you're high, that's performance enhancing. Also considered mixed martial arts, you're dealing with a lot of joint locks, elbow locks, arm bars, leg locks and such. These can be overcome by athletes who have greater flexibility, right? The better flexibility you have, the less likely those things are going to force you to tap out. So that could be, the being less pain, more flexibility from cannabis could also be performance enhancing. So that said, in my interviews with all of these mixed martial artists, they have told me, hell no, we're not getting high before the fight. Hell no. No way, right? They want to be sharp, on top of their game. After the fight, on the other hand, oh yeah, that's when the smoking kicks in. That's when you head back to the locker room. That's when you enjoy yourself, right? But so I thought that was a funny story, and it's good news just because so many athletes now are speaking out. We've spoken to Marvin Washington and Ricky Williams and from football, spoken to Riley Cote from hockey. A lot of these athletes who have told us, pot's been around in sports for decades, right? They've been using it for a long time. And the whole reason the sports leagues have been dinging people for their marijuana use has nothing to do with it being performance enhancing. It's all cultural. You're a bad person. Don't smoke marijuana, athlete. And now, Super Bowl, brought to you by Budweiser, right? Such hypocrisy. But now, as the laws are changing, we're in a situation now where I think there's only like 6 or 7 states left where the NFL plays that don't have medical marijuana, like, Tennessee Titans, Green Bay Packers, Atlanta Falcons, right? But most of the states where the NFL plays now, I think 3/4 of the teams now play where marijuana is legal. Similar stats for basketball, baseball, and so on. So, the moral angle, we can't have our prized athletes known to be pot smokers. Well, that moral angle is starting to fall away. And as more and more people understand the medical aspect of cannabis, and also understand how much pharmaceutical drugs we pump into these athletes, of course we should give them a safer choice. So good on UFC there for making that change. I just hope, NBA has also done this. NBA has basically, they're not exactly getting rid of testing, but they're saying they're not going to pay much attention to it in the NBA this season. It's long past time. I don't think Major League Baseball's testing anymore. NFL needs to stop doing it. There's just no reason anymore. Now, some other news that I wanted to bring up and go into a little more detail as well is what we're seeing now in the States, where marijuana legalization is now a $1 billion deal. Michigan just released their latest numbers, and they're like at 984 million. So just barely short of $1 billion. We had Illinois hit $1 billion this year. Massachusetts hit $1 billion this year. Washington, Oregon, all $1 billion in sales. Colorado just notched its first $2 billion year. $2 billion year. California, well, it did $3 billion back in 2017, but now it's like 2.5-ish because they've had a terrible rollout to legal marijuana in California. But all this is pointing to huge amounts of money for any of these other states that want to get involved. And already we've got New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, 4 states all looking to get on board with their sales. The US government now, the Census Agency, is going to start tracking how much these cannabis sales are throughout the rest of the states. So the green rush is well on. And now it's just a rush for all these other states to get involved before the big, before they miss out. 15 states are legal. We've got those 4 that I just mentioned going for legality this year. 2022 ballot initiatives, North Dakota, Nebraska, Idaho, all going for it. So we can have another 7 legal states by 2022. We can have half the United States legal, possibly, by 2022. I got to think of 3 more states. I think Kansas filed one, Indiana filed one. Not that Kansas, Indiana, or South Carolina are going to go anywhere, but still, we're making a ton of progress. And the money now, especially as we round the corner on this coronavirus issue, and all these state budgets have been blown out of the water because of having to pay for all the coronavirus issues, the monetary argument for legalizing marijuana has never been greater. This brings up some concerns. The number one concern that I've got is how quickly do we see the federal government making changes to accommodate the legal cannabis industry? We got the Banking Act, Safe Banking Act, that we want to get passed so that marijuana businesses in legal states can use banking facilities. We've got the MORE Act that passed the House but needs to get past the Senate that would take cannabis out of Schedule 1. And there'd be no longer a federal problem, a federal law against cannabis. And there would be a federal excise tax on cannabis that would be adding to the price of our cannabis. So the timing of all this is interesting. The Safe Banking Act would be great. We get safe banking, and now we have much more. We have much more access to investment funds. We have much more ability to expand in the states. But the MORE Act, this is where things get a little dicier. Right now, the situation that we're dealing with is 15 separate marijuana markets. A marijuana market in Washington, one for Oregon, one for California, Nevada, and so on. All the 15 states. Each has their own individual marijuana market. There are some big players who have places in multiple states, but when they do that, they have to set up a separate entity for each state to control those particular items. If we pass the MORE Act, and there's no longer a federal prohibition on cannabis, it now becomes an interstate product. It now becomes a federally commercial product. And that means the big boys can start taking over. That means whoever's got a ton of capital and a bunch of dispensaries in Oregon and Colorado can now expand to all of the states. The franchises can just multiply. With federal legalization comes the Walmartization of cannabis. With federal legalization comes the big box stores. Now, the other big ticket issue in marijuana right now is equity. How do we ensure that the communities that were devastated by the war on drugs, black and brown communities mostly, how do we ensure that they get an equitable share of the industry? How do we ensure that they can get involved in the cannabis industry? And already it's not working out so well. Had a story this week about Illinois missing the mark. They're fighting over, they wanted to create 75 new licenses, but there was a fight over how those licenses would go out, so nobody gets any licenses. New York has been hung up on, is there going to be equity provision? Is there not going to be equity provision? New Jersey currently hung up on how are we going to handle the equity issue. So if we can't manage the equity issue when we've got control over it in a single state, how much better does the equity issue work once it's federalized and the big corporate players start playing? I mean, I'm asking the question because I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if federalization actually works to the benefit of equity provisions or to its detriment. My gut tells me detriment. My gut tells me federalization just means more rich white guys. But I don't know. Not that I'm against rich white guys, hey. I'd like to be one. But it's something to consider. It's something to consider as we move forward with what could be federal descheduling. How do we move forward with an eye toward equity and an eye toward the consumer? That's another consideration. As this becomes bigger and bigger business, as state after state posts billion-dollar after billion-dollar results, they're going to want to keep that money flowing. And if they're making $1 billion because weed costs $250 an ounce, there's a lot of incentive to keep that at $250 an ounce. And then also consider that federal legalization is going to throw in, I think, were they talking a 5% excise, I think? But anyway, it's going to jack the price up of legal weed again, when already one of the talking points against it is that it's not killing the black market. We have to take a break. Be right back. Howdy.
Hello?
Check your ID, please. Thank you. Right on. What we get you today? Yeah. We got some watermelon skills.
All right, that's a little like me.
Ounce of watermelon skills. Coming right up.
And you have points too.
All right.
There's Tim. Watermelon skills, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty good for the price, gotta say. And what's your last name again?
Griffith.
Well, you got 190 points so far.
Woo.
All right, $100. You. Here you go. Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Told you I might have to sell some weed. Welcome back, everyone. Radical Russ hanging out with you here in Sumter, Oregon at the Coffee Pot Dispensary. Want to give you some science news now when it comes to marijuana. We got a great report, a great study that came out recently. It was in the Journal of Pain Medicine. And they took a look at over 1,000 patients. This was in Canada. They had like 21 pain clinics that looked at. All right, I don't know if they're pain clinics, just medical clinics, right? So with over 1,000, over 1,100 patients, they put them on a regimen of medical cannabis, and they also tracked their use of opioids, non-opioid prescriptions, benzodiazepines, etc. Right? And they found declines in all of them. Like the people that used cannabis, they found declines in just about all of the prescription drugs that they were taking. In fact, it was a 78% reduction in mean daily opioid dosage. So the average dose, like someone who's taking opioids for pain, let's say they were taking 400 milligrams. Well, if they could have medical cannabis, they ended up only taking 100 milligrams, dropped it by 3/4. Right? They still had to use opioids, just not as much. Now, I will verify this till the cows come home. My dad is an opiate patient. He's got chronic diabetic neuropathy, right? It's a nerve pain. And they had him on 60 milligrams, 60 milligram dose of OxyContin. And he had to take it, multiple times a day, right? Every 4 hours or so, right? And God, it was just awful, right? Because my dad's a really bright guy, but it made him all foggy and grumpy and, just had terrible physical side effects, constipation and so on. And so I finally got him to, try some medical cannabis. I said, this won't make it so you don't have to use opioids, but you might have to use less, right? Well, since he started on medical cannabis, he's down to 10 milligram doses. From 60 to 10. Still has to have it, but not as much. And that was the reduction, the 78% reduction. That was for the patients that had to use opiates every day, right? They also checked, for the non-daily users. Here's what they found. So they did this for 6 months. After 6 months, non-opioid prescription drugs had dropped 64%, damn near 2/3. Opioids, and we're talking people not using, right? The previous stat was they used opioids daily, but now they use less. These stats are people who were able to stop using those drugs. So almost 2/3 of the people, 64% using a non-opioid prescription drug, stopped using it once they got medical cannabis. For opioids, it was 60%. 3 out of 5 opioid users stopped using opiates when they got medical cannabis. Benzos, Xanax, those kind of things. Benzodiazepines dropped 54%, more than half. Antidepressants dropped 38%, about a third. Anti-seizure medication dropped 34%, about a third. So, now let's put a caveat in here. The study was sponsored by Tilray. Tilray is a huge Canadian cannabis corporation, and they were giving vouchers out to these study participants to be able to use medical cannabis. So there might be a little selection bias going on. Still, this comports with so many studies and so many people's personal anecdotes about medical cannabis that once they're able to get access to medical cannabis, their use of other prescription drugs drops by a third, by a half, by 2/3, by 3/4, depending on the drug. So, if you were ever curious about why there was so much initial opposition to medical cannabis within the medical industry, pharmaceutical industry, rehab industry, well, it's pretty clear why. If you sold cars and there was something out there threatening to cut your car sales in half, you'd be against it too. This is all about the money. Any remaining opposition to medical marijuana is about somebody not getting money out of it. And it's almost a finished argument now. Nationwide, depending on what state you poll, the support for medical marijuana can be anywhere from, well, like in Idaho, it's about 74%. It might be one of the lowest rates, to well over 90. Most states, it's over 90% support now. nobody, let's just say very few people have an issue with someone who's sick or disabled using cannabis. What's weird to me is that there still remain people who have an issue with non-sick people using cannabis. The numbers, when you do the polling, you get like, I'm going to use Idaho, let's say. You get 75% support for medical, let's say. And then you go and poll recreational and you get 50% support. Or hell, let's use South Dakota. South Dakota just passed their medical by 70%. They just passed their legalization by 54%. So that means that there's like 16% of the population is fine with punishing a non-sick person for cannabis. Like, I get the people who are 100% against marijuana, whether you're sick, whether you're well. I get that. Like, you think marijuana is evil. If people have access to marijuana, it increases evil in the world. At least that's consistent. But when you're somebody who supports medical but not recreational, I don't get it. This terrible herb is so dangerous, we can't let healthy people smoke it, but it's okay for sick people to smoke it. Sick people with compromised immune systems and weakness, they can handle weed, but healthy people can't. I don't get it. I get the should part of it. Like if someone's saying they shouldn't use it, I get that. But this idea of it's dangerous somehow when you're healthy, but it's not dangerous when you're sick, that I don't get. Like take cough syrup, right? We accept people using cough syrup for medical purposes. You've got a scratchy throat, you take some cough syrup. But people also use cough syrup for recreational purposes. They use scissorup, right? They DXM, they get off on it, right? But did that make the cough syrup any more dangerous than it was when the sick person was drinking it? No. Do we make someone prove they have a cough before we let them buy the cough syrup? No. Because the cough syrup didn't change. It's the same cough syrup. It's the same marijuana. So why punish a healthy person for it and not a sick person? It can't be for preventing harm, so it has to be a social control. It has to be a culture war. That can be the only explanation. It has to be a punitive measure. It has to be an authority saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. Why not? Because I said so. That's really where we are with marijuana prohibition at this point. And to get even more absurd on this tangent. So we started with medical marijuana because, well, we can't let healthy people have it, but okay, if you're sick, we'll let you smoke a joint. So we started with medical marijuana in California and the West Coast, and they create it so there's no stores, but you can grow your own. But then as medical marijuana advances and heads east and gets through legislatures, they take away that home grow, and some of them take away the whole plant part itself. Like Minnesota and New York and these states that say, no, you can't have whole plant marijuana, but you can have these concentrates and edibles that are far more potent. Like, what? You're not allowing them to have the less potent flower, but you are allowing them to have the more potent dabs because danger? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Then again, prohibition never makes a whole lot of sense, does it? All right, folks, that's about all the time I've got for today. Going to wrap things up here from our non-studio location here in Sumter, Oregon at the Coffee Pot Dispensary. Thank you all for joining me for this hour of the Russ Belville Show. We're not going to have a Toker Talk Radio for this week, just because, again, I'm not in the studio and don't have access to all my equipment that I need. But for everyone here At the Coffee Pot in Oregon, selling legal weed for the past 3.5 years, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.